At 32, Sarah Anderson sat in the driver's seat of her sleek Tesla, staring at the sprawling suburban house she once called home. The familiar sight of her parents' perfectly manicured lawn, the pristine white siding, and those tacky garden gnomes her mother adored made her heart tighten. Despite the successful tech empire she had built from the ground up, she couldn't shake the feeling of being that 16-year-old girl, insufficient, inadequate, and forever falling short of her father's expectations. This was supposed to be a celebration of her mother's 60th birthday. Yet Sarah could already feel the knot forming in her stomach. Taking a deep breath, Sarah grabbed the carefully wrapped gift, a painting her mother had once admired but never bought, and made her way to the front door. Her father, Gregory, greeted her with his usual critical gaze. "You're late," he remarked, his tone dismissive. "Couldn't even dress up properly for your mother's milestone birthday?" He eyed her designer pantsuit as though it were some extravagant mistake. Behind him, her mother, Claire, appeared with a warm, if anxious, smile, greeting Sarah with a genuine embrace. But even in her mother's affection, Sarah noticed the hall lined with family photos, her sister Emily's awards, graduation pictures, and moments of success that seemed to shine while Sarah's own achievements were ignored. Sarah's father had always been clear about his priorities. Emily had chosen a path of traditional success, and Sarah's choice to pursue a career in tech was nothing but a disappointment. No matter how far Sarah had come, building her own company and becoming a respected leader in her field, she was always the daughter who didn't belong in the family's narrative. But tonight, she was determined to endure, for her mother's sake. The tension in the room thickened as Sarah walked past the family photos, each one a reminder of her position in the family hierarchy. At Innovate Tech, she was a force to be reckoned with, a CEO respected by industry leaders and employees alike. Yet in her father's house, she was still the daughter who had chosen the wrong path, someone who could never quite measure up to the flawless image of success he had envisioned for his family. Sarah straightened her back, preparing to endure another evening of patronizing remarks and veiled criticisms, determined to get through it for her mother. Growing up, Gregory had made sure everyone knew exactly where they stood. He was the pillar of the family, a successful accountant who believed in hard work, traditional values, and clear-cut paths to success. He had shaped their family dynamic with unwavering authority, and for years, Sarah had tried to live up to his exacting standards. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough. While Emily, her younger sister, eagerly followed Gregory's blueprint, excelling in finance and business, Sarah had been made to feel that her passion for technology was a misguided pursuit. Something for boys, and certainly not a respectable career for a woman. She recalled the day she'd won the national science competition in high school. The phone call had come during dinner, but it barely registered with her father, who was more concerned with getting to Emily's recital on time. It had become clear to Sarah that no achievement, no matter how significant, would ever be enough. Her father's approval was a fleeting, impossible dream, and when she dared to pursue a career in technology, despite his repeated insistence that she follow a more conventional path, the rift between them deepened. Now, as she sat in her father's living room, Sarah tried to swallow the bitter sting of his dismissive words. As her father began to entertain relatives with stories of Emily's success, Sarah forced herself to tune out the familiar sting of neglect. Emily had the life her father wanted for her, perfect grades, a prestigious career, and the kind of stability Gregory valued. Sarah, on the other hand, had built something of her own, a company that was shaping the future of education technology. But in her family's eyes, her accomplishments seemed insignificant. Her mother, Claire, hovered nearby, trying her best to keep the peace. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was invisible in her own home. Her mother's pride in her career had always been quiet, whispered in private, but never loud enough to drown out Gregory's criticism. Despite all her success, all Sarah wanted was for her father to see her, to acknowledge her work, her efforts, her resilience. But that would never happen, not as long as Gregory held on to his outdated, rigid view of success. And so, she endured, doing her best to hold her head high in a room that seemed to have no place for her. As Sarah quietly observed the interactions around her, She couldn't help but feel the growing distance between her and her family. Every glance her father gave her, every comment about her career, felt like a reminder that she would always be the disappointing daughter. Her successes in the tech world were not even acknowledged, while her sister Emily's accomplishments were celebrated with every possible accolade. Sarah's achievements, however impressive in her field, seemed to carry no weight here, in the house that had been shaped by her father's unyielding expectations. Sarah's mind wandered back to her college years, specifically to the Thanksgiving dinner that had become family legend. Though not for any of the right reasons, she had spent months developing a business plan for a software startup, working tirelessly on securing angel investors who saw potential in her adaptive learning platform. When she finally announced her plans to pursue the startup, her father's reaction was swift and harsh. He couldn't understand why she would choose playing with computers over building a respectable career. As though her ambition, her drive, and her vision didn't matter. It was just another failure in his eyes, another example of how Sarah never measured up. Her mother, Claire, had tried to mediate, as she always did, suggesting that Sarah's interest in technology might eventually lead to a successful career. But Gregory wasn't listening. Sarah's father, the proud man who had built his life on traditional values, couldn't comprehend the rapidly changing world she was stepping into. Instead of supporting her, he dismissed her aspirations as trivial and unworthy of his attention. When Emily came home with another perfect report card, another achievement, her father's praises were endless, while Sarah's success in the tech world was ignored. Years had passed, and although Sarah's company had grown from a fledgling startup to a respected player in the industry, nothing had changed in her family's perception of her. She had endured years of backhanded compliments and silence from her father. And yet, every year, she returned to these family gatherings, hoping for something different, something more. But each visit only seemed to deepen the divide, as though the more she succeeded outside of their expectations, the further she fell from their approval. And now, as she stood in the midst of yet another family celebration, she realized the truth. No matter how far she went, no matter how much she achieved, she would always be the daughter who didn't belong. At least, not in the eyes of the one person whose approval mattered most, her father. As she listened to him praise Emily's latest career milestone, Sarah found herself questioning why she even bothered to come. Why keep chasing approval from someone who would never see her for who she truly was? The pain of rejection, while familiar, was still sharp, and Sarah wondered if, for once, it was time to stop seeking their validation and start creating her own path. On her terms. As the evening stretched on, Sarah found herself lost in the blur of family conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the endless stream of praise for Emily. Her father's voice boomed with pride as he recounted his daughter's recent promotion at the financial firm she worked for. While Sarah's presence seemed to fade into the background, she wasn't surprised. This was the pattern. After all, her accomplishments were always sidelined in favor of Emily's traditional successes. And tonight was no different. But what caught her off guard was the quiet presence of Daniel, her sister's boyfriend, who, unbeknownst to anyone, had worked closely with Sarah in her company. Daniel had recently become the head of software development at Innovate Tech, and his presence at the family gathering was a reminder of the vast difference between the world her father celebrated and the world Sarah had built. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was the man who had helped push her company to new heights, standing in her father's living room, treated like an outsider. It was almost too much to bear. The sharp contrast between Daniel's professional respect for her and the dismissive attitude of her father, who still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge her business as anything more than a passing interest. As Sarah quietly sipped her wine, trying to keep her composure, Daniel's eyes met hers. A flicker of recognition passed between them. But before she could process it, her father's voice interrupted once again, loudly proclaiming how Emily's career was a reflection of their family's values, hard work, dedication, and a proper path to success. Sarah felt the familiar sting of inadequacy. But this time, something inside her shifted. She was no longer willing to accept the role of the invisible daughter. It was then that Daniel, seemingly sensing the weight of the moment, cleared his throat and spoke up. "Actually," he began, his voice calm and respectful, "Sarah's company, Innovate Tech, is one of the most innovative educational platforms I've ever worked with." He continued, explaining the groundbreaking work Sarah's team had done, the contracts they had secured, and the success they were seeing in school districts across the country. The room fell silent, the tension palpable as Daniel's words hung in the air. For a moment, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a spark of validation, but then she saw it, the look of disbelief on her father's face, the narrowing of his eyes, as he struggled to reconcile the image of Sarah he had held for so long with the woman standing before him. The cognitive dissonance was too much for him to handle. Sarah had expected as much, but it still stung, as her father tried to dismiss Daniel's comments. Sarah knew something had changed. For the first time in years, her accomplishments were being acknowledged by someone outside of her own mind. It wasn't the recognition she had longed for from her father, but it was enough. She wasn't invisible anymore. In that brief moment, Sarah realized that her self-worth no longer depended on her father's approval. It was time to redefine who she was, not by the standards set by others, but by the success she had built for herself. The family dynamic had shifted, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she had the power to change the narrative. The conversation around the table shifted uneasily as Sarah watched her father attempt to regain control of the narrative. His face was flushed with a mix of confusion and irritation, his posture rigid as he redirected the conversation back to safer, more familiar ground. Yet Sarah couldn't ignore the slight crack in his carefully constructed facade. For the first time, her father wasn't able to simply dismiss her achievements with a sneer or a wave of his hand. Daniel's words had broken through, even if her father was too proud to admit it. As her father continued to steer the conversation, Sarah's mind raced. She realized the truth. Her father's disapproval had always been a constant force in her life, shaping her decisions, limiting her potential, and forcing her to fight for every scrap of validation. But tonight, something had shifted. Despite his best efforts to belittle her accomplishments, Sarah had been seen. The truth about Innovate Tech was out in the open, and there was no going back. She had always been good enough. The problem had never been her. It had been the narrow lens through which her father viewed success. She glanced over at her mother, Claire, who stood at the periphery of the conversation, a silent observer of the unfolding drama. For years, Claire had been the peacekeeper, stepping in whenever the tension between Sarah and Gregory reached a boiling point. But tonight, something was different. Claire wasn't stepping in. Instead, she was watching the family dynamic with a quiet intensity, as if she too was processing the weight of the truth. Sarah knew that her mother had always struggled with the divide between her and Gregory, but the events of the evening seemed to be forcing a reckoning. When the birthday cake was finally brought out, Sarah's heart tightened. Her father, ever the showman, made a grand speech about family values, placing Emily and Rebecca at the center of his narrative. Sarah, as always, was relegated to the sidelines. But even as he spoke, Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her. She was no longer the daughter who had to shrink in the shadows of her family's expectations. She had built something remarkable, and for the first time, she wasn't going to let her father's dismissiveness steal her sense of self. As the evening came to a close, Sarah made her way to the kitchen, her mother's voice calling her over. "Can we talk?" Claire asked, her tone tentative. For the first time, Sarah felt a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her mother was beginning to see her for who she truly was, not through the lens of her father's influence, but as the woman she had become. It was a small shift, but it was enough to make Sarah believe that change, however slow, was finally possible. She could no longer remain bound by the expectations of a family that refused to see her for who she was. Tonight had marked a turning point, one that might allow her to build a future where she could thrive. Not despite her family, but alongside them. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself retreating into a corner of the living room, trying to process the events of the night. The small victories felt fragile, like delicate glass that could shatter with the slightest touch. She had been seen, acknowledged for her success, but the real test would come when she faced her family again. The tension between her and her father was far from resolved. It had been momentarily interrupted, but it would resurface the next time they gathered. Her thoughts were interrupted by Claire's soft voice calling her over to the kitchen. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure of what this conversation would bring. Her mother had always played the role of peacekeeper, smoothing over the cracks and keeping the family's delicate balance in place. But tonight, Sarah had sensed a subtle shift in her mother, an openness, a willingness to confront the long-standing patterns that had kept her silent for so many years. Perhaps, for the first time, Claire was ready to see her daughter without the filter of Gregory's influence. Sarah crossed the room, her steps slow and measured. When she entered the kitchen, Claire was standing at the counter, a few glasses in hand. She smiled faintly when she saw Sarah. "I thought we might talk," Claire said softly, setting the glasses down and turning to face her daughter. There was something different in her eyes, an unspoken understanding that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking," Claire began, her voice trembling slightly as she took a breath, "about everything you've done, and everything I allowed." She paused, as though gathering the right words. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in their relationship. It was as if the walls her mother had built over the years were slowly starting to crumble, allowing room for something more real, more vulnerable. "I should have seen you for who you are, not just as Gregory's daughter or Rebecca's sister," Claire continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have been proud of what you've accomplished from the very beginning, not just stayed quiet while he dismissed everything you did." For the first time in years, Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. It wasn't sadness, but relief. Relief that her mother was finally acknowledging the truth, that she was finally breaking free of the narrative that had defined Sarah's place in the family. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and wrapped her arms around her mother. Claire held her tightly, as if afraid that Sarah might slip away again. "I wish I could have done more sooner," Claire whispered, "but I won't let him control the narrative anymore." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. This conversation, though long overdue, marked a significant change in their relationship. She could feel the first stirrings of something new, of a future where she no longer had to live under the shadow of her father's expectations, where she could define her own worth and carve her own path. It wasn't going to be easy, but tonight, Sarah felt like she had taken the first real step toward reclaiming her place in her family, not as the daughter who never belonged, but as the woman she had fought so hard to become. As Sarah stepped away from her mother, still feeling the warmth of their rare moment of connection, she knew that the evening was far from over. Her father, though physically absent from the kitchen, still held dominion over the family narrative. The weight of his dismissive words lingered in the air, the sound of his critical voice echoing in Sarah's mind. His influence was so ingrained that even the small shift in her mother's awareness felt like a battle half won, not the final victory. As they re-entered the living room, Sarah was acutely aware of how different things had felt just moments ago. Her father had unwittingly exposed a crack in his carefully crafted reality. And now, the family dynamic seemed to be in flux. The relatives who had once regarded her with indifference were now casting curious glances her way. For years, they had absorbed her father's dismissive narrative, as though Sarah's success in the tech world was a mere illusion. Yet, the factual corrections Daniel had provided earlier were still rippling through the room. Daniel, her sister's boyfriend, had known exactly how to challenge her father's version of the truth without ever stepping out of line. He hadn't just exposed her professional achievements, he had also given the family a glimpse of the woman Sarah had become, an individual worthy of recognition, not dismissal. Sarah's eyes met Daniel's across the room. His respectful gaze lingered on her, but there was no trace of pity or discomfort. Instead, there was a sense of admiration, and a quiet understanding passed between them. For the first time, Sarah felt a sense of validation from someone outside her immediate family, someone who didn't carry the weight of years of misjudgment. Rebecca, sensing the shift, approached Sarah cautiously. "I had no idea," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of confusion and something else, perhaps a newfound respect. Sarah glanced at her sister, seeing the hesitation in her eyes. For so long, Rebecca had been the golden child, the one who followed the prescribed path, the one who succeeded according to their father's standards. Now, Sarah saw her struggling with the realization that she had unknowingly perpetuated their father's narrative of her failure. "Why didn't you ever correct us?" Rebecca asked, the question hanging in the air. "All these years, we just thought it didn't matter," Sarah replied, her voice steady, though her heart ached at the truth of it. "It never mattered to him. And it didn't matter enough to me until now." The words were like a weight lifted from her chest, as if a burden she had been carrying for years was finally being shared. This moment, this acknowledgement, was a victory in its own right. It wasn't the approval she had longed for from her father, but it was enough. As the evening wore on and the family gathered around the table, Sarah realized that her path to healing wouldn't come from waiting for her father's validation. It would come from reclaiming her own narrative, from building her relationships on terms that reflected who she truly was, not who they had expected her to be. The night was far from perfect. The conversations were awkward, the old wounds still raw, but for the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a quiet belief that, perhaps, she could rebuild these relationships on her terms, with honesty and understanding, rather than the false expectations that had defined them for so long. The night stretched on, and Sarah continued to wrestle with the emotions that had been stirred by her family's shifting dynamics. As she sat back down in the living room, her mind continued to replay the moments when Daniel had spoken up. His words had changed everything, but now the room felt different, charged with new energy, new awareness. For the first time, Sarah was no longer the invisible daughter, dismissed and disregarded in favor of her sister's more conventional path. Her father's dismissive remarks still stung, but she had caught a glimpse of what could be, a family that recognized her worth, not just as an extension of her father's ideal, but as her own person, with her own achievements and a legacy to stand on. Her mother, Claire, had already begun to shift in the way she viewed Sarah. It was small at first, but Sarah could see it, her mother's softer gaze, the way she now seemed to listen with more attention, as if she was finally seeing Sarah as the woman she had become, rather than the daughter who never quite fit into their plans. But even with her mother's support, the weight of years of rejection was not easily forgotten. For so long, Sarah had been the underdog in her own family's story, and it wasn't going to be erased in a single night. Across the room, Rebecca and Daniel were engaged in a quiet conversation. Sarah watched them, noting the subtle way Daniel glanced at her. His eyes filled with a quiet respect. It was the kind of acknowledgement she had longed for all her life. But it wasn't from the family that had been blind to her success. It came from someone who recognized her for who she truly was. Someone who knew her professional accomplishments without any of the baggage that came with being her father's daughter. Rebecca, too, was changing, but in a way that was complicated. She was still trying to reconcile the version of Sarah that had always been the failure in their father's eyes with the successful woman standing before her now. But the awkwardness of that realization was palpable, and for the first time, Sarah felt a shift in the air. Rebecca was finally seeing her, and it wasn't the same as before. There was no longer the competition, the subtle undercurrent of superiority that used to characterize their relationship. Instead, Sarah saw genuine curiosity in her sister's eyes, a willingness to learn more about her life, her business, and the woman she had become. Despite the tension still hanging in the air, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet triumph. Tonight hadn't been perfect. There were still old wounds, old patterns that would take time to untangle. But for the first time, Sarah felt seen. She had spent so many years trying to prove herself to a family that would never acknowledge her achievements. But now, the walls had begun to crack. Slowly but surely, the family she had longed for was beginning to take shape, a family that respected her, saw her for who she truly was, and didn't try to fit her into the narrow mold they had once defined for her. Sarah realized that she didn't need her father's approval anymore. It would take time for him to adjust to the truth. But the truth had been spoken, and for the first time, it felt like enough. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything that had transpired. The tension in the room had shifted, but she wasn't sure if it was permanent. The cracks in her father's perception of her were small, but they were there, and she had made sure they wouldn't close so easily. Her father's dismissive comments, though still sharp, didn't cut as deeply as they once did. For the first time, Sarah wasn't seeking his approval. She was no longer the girl who longed to prove her worth to him. That realization, though freeing, also left her feeling conflicted. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet his expectations, trying to fit into a role that had never truly suited her. Her mother, Claire, seemed to be slowly awakening to the reality that Sarah had always been more than the disappointing daughter her father had painted her to be. But Sarah knew the change wouldn't come overnight. Claire had spent years suppressing her own voice in favor of keeping the peace with Gregory, and Sarah couldn't expect that dynamic to shift all at once. Yet, tonight was different. Sarah could feel the distance between them slowly closing as Claire began to understand her daughter's journey, her struggles, and her victories. For the first time, Sarah felt that her mother wasn't just an unwilling participant in her father's narrative. She was someone who could acknowledge Sarah's accomplishments with pride, not just regret. Rebecca's presence in the conversation, though still awkward, had also shifted. Sarah noticed the subtle way her sister's questions now came from a place of curiosity, rather than competition. It was as if the walls that had separated them for so long were beginning to crumble. Emily's success had always been the measure by which Sarah was judged. But now, Sarah's own achievements, her company, her leadership, her drive, were being seen as worthy of recognition. Rebecca had no choice but to face the reality that Sarah had built something remarkable, even if their father hadn't been willing to see it. Despite everything, Sarah couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of victory. The family dynamic wasn't fixed, but the foundation had been laid for something more genuine. Tonight had been a reminder that her worth didn't depend on her father's approval. And that was a realization she could carry forward with her. She wasn't just the daughter of Gregory Mitchell, she was Sarah Anderson, a woman who had built something extraordinary with her own hands. For the first time, that was enough. As Sarah sat quietly, reflecting on the evening, she realized that the most important lesson she had learned wasn't about proving her worth to her family. It was about proving it to herself. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her father's expectations, constantly striving for approval that was never forthcoming. Yet tonight, she had seen the cracks in the facade, the small shifts in her family's perceptions, and she had realized something incredibly powerful. Her value didn't depend on anyone else's acknowledgement. It wasn't easy to accept that her family might never fully understand her path or the depth of her success. But in that moment, Sarah understood that true fulfillment comes from within. It's about defining your worth on your own terms and not waiting for anyone else to validate it. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. Don't wait for permission to chase your dreams. And don't let anyone tell you who you can be or how you should measure your success. No matter where you come from or what obstacles you face, your journey is yours alone to navigate. Stand firm in who you are, and trust that your hard work, your passion, and your resilience will speak for themselves. Lesson of the day: your worth is not defined by others, but by your actions, your resilience, and your ability to keep pushing forward, no matter the challenges. If Sarah's story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever struggled with the expectations of others? How did you overcome it? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of strength, resilience, and the power of self-belief. Let's keep the conversation going.